How do you write about stories? Your instructor might ask you to write one of several types of papers. For instance, a response paper, an explication, or a research paper. But this section guides you through only one of those, an interpretive essay. An interpretive essay tells your readers what you think the story means, and then you make an argument for that interpretation with evidence from the text. Interpretation is the core of just about any critical essay, even research papers, so the advice here will probably serve you no matter what your specific assignment is. In the beginning of this book, I said that you already interpret stories intuitively. You've internalized the language of narrative, so you can understand stories almost instinctively. You get their meaning. Because meaning comes first through our imaginative experience of reading a story, there's a temptation to think that all interpretations are equally valid. I once had a student who offered what I thought was a pretty unusual interpretation of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. I asked her to explain why she thought the story meant what she asserted it did, and she replied, "That's what the story means to me." I hear that kind of reasoning often, and on the one hand, I can't really argue with it. She was the highest authority on what something meant to her. But on the other hand, when you write an interpretive paper, you're adding a dimension to that claim. You're asserting not only what the story means to you, but also that your reader ought to agree with you. In other words, you're trying to persuade people that the meaning you take from the story is probably the meaning that the story intended you to get. When you think of interpretation that way, it becomes clear that some interpretations are more plausible than others, and some are so implausible we might as well say they're wrong. This section will explain how to develop your own interpretations, and once you've done that, how to best present them to others persuasively. Theme, meaning, and interpretation. One of the first things you want to do is determine what you think the story is about. I do not mean what it's about in a literal sense, but in a figurative sense. For example, it is pretty obvious that the parable of the prodigal son is about a man who chooses to live a wayward life and ends up begging forgiveness from his father. But the story is also about things that are more abstract: prodigality, remorse of conscience, mercy. It has something to say about these, and jealousy too. These are its themes. So theme is what the story is about on an abstract level. Those generalized issues dramatized in or embodied by the characters and action. Theme distinguishes fiction from most of the stories you read in newspapers. A newspaper will tell a story merely because it happened. A plane crashed, and everyone on board died. The president gave a speech in a nearby city. A famous actor got married. The Red Sox beat the Yankees in extra innings. These stories usually don't have any larger thematic importance. Sometimes they do. For example, when the unsinkable Titanic sank on its maiden voyage, many saw the event as an enormous reminder of the puniness of humans as compared to nature or God, and as a rebuke for our pride. When the Twin Towers were attacked, everyone wanted to interpret the events. What was their meaning? Was this about religion? Was it about democracy? Was it about America's role in the world? But when most reporters write their stories, they are not exploring abstract themes. They are telling us what happened, and we read their stories because they tell us the news. Once the news is stale, we don't read the stories again. They have nothing more to say to us. Fictional stories last longer because their themes broaden the scope of the events they relate. They are about more than the individual characters and events they narrate. You could imagine the events in Alice Walker's Everyday Use as they might be recited in a newspaper. The news article would have the same characters and events as the fictional story. On a literal level, it would be about a family visit. A long-absent daughter visited her mother and sister today and tried to leave with an heirloom quilt. But as told in fiction, the story is also about poverty, social mobility, heritage, family, and race relations, among other subjects. Those are some of its themes. Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour is about marriage, domestic duties, life in the American middle class, and probably half a dozen other things you might name. This multiplicity of themes is characteristic of fiction. 6 readers of the same story might be interested in 6 different themes. A story's meaning is what it has to say about its themes. Ask yourself the further question: what does everyday use have to say about family dynamics? Or what does The Story of an Hour tell us about marriage? In this sense, we can almost think of stories like a political argument, an editorial, an academic essay, or any other persuasive speech or piece of expository writing. In fact, one of the most influential stories of fiction, a book that has a pretty big influence on this volume, is Wayne Booth's The Rhetoric of Fiction. The word rhetoric implies that what a story does to readers is a kind of persuasion. Just as an essay might try to persuade readers to believe something about, say, patriotism or friendship, so could a story. But literature has this big difference from most persuasive writing. It mainly moves through the imagination of readers. Things like political speeches or thesis-driven essays, such as the one you may be writing, mainly use logic, what English teachers call argumentation, to influence your opinions. Arguments touch you more superficially, like wind on the surface of a lake. Imaginative literature moves like deep ocean currents, where your heart swims. Reading a short story can be like entering a virtual reality. You see the scene, you hear the words and sounds, you feel the whoosh of the train coming through the subway station, and the smell, the summer rain steaming on hot pavement. And as you read stories, you get to know the characters, the way you know people in real life, and often more intimately than you know real-life people. Because it is so tied up in imagination, the meaning of stories can be hard to pin down, almost as hard as interpreting the meaning of life itself. We don't read stories to extract some sort of moral, as we would read a fable. Short stories do not offer some universally applicable lesson that can be easily paraphrased, such as "slow and steady wins the race," which is the meaning of Aesop's fable of the tortoise and the hare. It's pretty hard work to put into your own clear prose what a story does to you on a deep level. Meaning involves how a story makes readers feel, what it makes them think about, where it directs their sympathies. All things you don't expect from expository prose. Your interpretation is what you think the story means. Your thesis is a statement, usually a sentence or two, that sums up that interpretation. Just as a story might have several themes, it can also support several different, sometimes even contradictory, interpretations. And while meaning might be tough to pin down, you can follow some simple steps that will help you do it. The following sections offer some practical advice for developing your interpretation and give you strategies for persuading others of its validity. The writing process. No one, not even the cleverest literary critic, can write an effective interpretive essay completely off the top of her head. Thinking takes you only so far. It is by writing that we generate ideas, test those ideas with evidence, try our arguments, rethink our initial notions, revise our strategies of persuasion. Rhetoricians describe the writing process as recursive. In other words, writing a paper rarely follows step-by-step instructions like a recipe in a cookbook, even if it sometimes is represented that way in textbooks like this one. When you're cooking, you might have to melt butter before you toss the onions in the pan. And you might have to saute the onions before you put them in the soup. Steps go in a necessary order. Writing doesn't work that way. You'll find yourself constantly circling back to earlier steps. Don't worry if it seems more natural for you to do step 4 before you've finished step 2. And don't worry about going back to step 3 after you've finished step 5. Follow your instincts. The writing process is not linear. It spirals back on itself all the time. Nor should you worry about completing each and every step in the first place. Writing is a lot messier than cooking, and you should violate these instructions whenever you're more productive by going your own way. Skipping a step, adding your own step. Writing is very individual. No two people go through the process exactly the same way. One of the most important things you can do in a writing class is to figure out what the most productive writing process is for you. You might find that you can't generate your ideas unless you're already writing a rough draft of your paper. So you might begin with drafting rather than discovery. Or you might find that you can't think of anything to say when you're at the keyboard, that you need a cup of coffee, a pen, and your literature book open to the story. Everybody does it a little differently, and you've got to figure out what's your most productive process. But the one universal is this: writing is a process. It takes several stages to produce an effective paper, and each of these stages takes time and energy. Your hard work will be rewarded with several intellectual pleasures, but remember that writing an interpretive essay is hard work. Those pleasures do not come easy. Stage 1, discovery. Discovery simply means finding things to say. You discover ideas and evidence. Discovery is a collaboration between you and the story. You bring to the story all sorts of things: your knowledge of how the world works and how people behave, your sense of right and wrong, your own personal set of things that you tend to notice and things you tend to overlook, that individualize your experience of the text. In discovery, you explore your own interaction with the story. You slow it down and observe it. Reading the story, and then reading it again, is the first stage of discovery. You might think that reading goes without saying, but my experience teaching literature courses tells me it's worth a few words, because there's reading, and then there's close reading. The first time you read a story, let it work on your imagination. Don't worry about anything other than entering the world of the story and enjoying it. Let the story do things to you. Then read it a second time in order to begin analyzing it. That means consciously thinking about character, plot, symbolism, etc. This is what English teachers call close reading. You're reading the text with a more specific purpose than the general reader. You're not just letting it do things to you. You're trying to figure out how it does things to you. How does it get you to like this character? Where does it make your heart race? And how did it do it? You're looking more closely, looking for specific things, using examination tools almost the way a scientist will use some specialized instrument, a microscope or a spectrometer or stethoscope. Your toolbox is chock full with all of those instruments I discussed in How Do You Read Stories.